So thanks a lot for coming to Odaiba. It's this fabulous place where everything is possible. Thanks to Yuichi Konishi. He's hiding over there. Thanks a lot for having us here. Great view and great people. So this is you are sitting at a Crossroads event. This is the third official public Crossroads event, and at every single one of those, we are trying to explore the contact between academic science and AI in particular, but all intelligence sciences and the industry, and see how we can make the best from this contact between both, and especially from intersections between both. Crossroads is organized by Cross Compass, who founded recently in last April, if you haven't heard about it, Cross Labs, which is our new research institute. We are really excited to have this fundamental research being developed in the industry. It's the first case that I know of in Japan that does that seriously, and this is organized by Katsunobu Suzuki, our CEO, and by Antoine, our director of research. And tonight we have a real treat because Antoine is actually going to be presenting. And Antoine Pasquali is originally a cognitive neuroscientist. I met him for the first time at the Consciousness Conference here in Japan, and we've been friends since then. He has very interesting views to share with you. And before I let him talk, this is our third event, and we'll continue, but we'll pause in August. So if you are interested, those Crossroads events happen every first Wednesday of every month, and the next one is going to be the first Wednesday of September, and we have
the second week, maybe.
Maybe the second week. We'll skip a week in September, correct? And we have someone lined up, very famous psychologist. I will tell you about that by email. Okay, so without further ado, Antoine, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Olaf. Thank you very much, Yuichi, for hosting this event. This means a lot to us, and we hope this is the beginning of a collaboration between Cross Compass and Progress Technologies. Let's discuss more. So today I'm going to talk, the topic is very broad. I'm going to talk about machines, brains, and super-AIs. I'll take just one slide to present myself. So my name is Antoine. I started training as an engineer. I studied computer science, automatic control and electronics, human-machine interface, artificial intelligence. That was in France. Then I moved to Belgium for another master. I studied deep learning and cognitive science. Then I went back to France, where I worked on robots. Then in Italy again on robots. I worked with the ICAB team, and I learned in developmental psychology with them. Then I went back to Belgium and I did a PhD on the topic of consciousness. Later on, I moved to Japan. I did a bit of neuroscience at Tokyo University. And later, it's been about 4 years now, I started to focus more on philosophical concerns. I'm going to discuss about all these different topics through this presentation. Right. So to address the problem of machines, brains, and super-AIs, I'm going to focus on what we call the mind-body problem, or actually we should say problems. And we can distinguish two types of problems, the easy ones and the hard one. I'm going to explain more in the first section of the presentation. Man is a machine. The brain has muscles for thinking, as the legs have muscles for walking. This is a claim by Delametre, a French physician of the 18th century. He is the father of materialism, which states that matter is the fundamental substance in nature. That is, everything that happens in nature comes from matter. And that includes our mental states and our consciousness. So, obviously, this has been challenged, but the question is how to prove materialism. It seems very complicated to show that man is a machine. And when you face a very complicated problem, one way to solve it is actually to try to reverse it. If we do that, here's what we have. Machine is a man. What this tells us is that if we try to build a machine that is like a man, we might prove materialism. Actually, von Kempelen already tried to do that also in the 18th century. He invented an automaton called the tub. Here's what it looks like. There is a robot, and this robot can play chess. You could play chess against the robot, and sometimes it would lose, but sometimes it would win. And Edgar Allan Poe, who was a contemporary of von Kempelen, well, he had a lot of doubts regarding this machine. He said, no, it's not possible, right? We are in the 18th century, there's nothing like that. And he said that this was a fraud. And he was right. There was actually a small man, a little person, hidden in the machine. In that case, the machine was literally a man. It's only 200 years later that this endeavor was taken seriously. In the summer of 1956 happened the Dartmouth workshop, and this marks the founding of artificial intelligence as a research discipline. Their goal was, I'm going to read it, it's very small, to proceed on the basis of the conjecture that every aspect of learning or any other feature of intelligence can, in principle, be so precisely described that a machine can be made to simulate it. So this is a very nice perspective, right? We could build a machine that would display the intelligence of living organisms. Well, hold on. Philosophers warn us, and in particular Thomas Nagel, who thinks that conscious mental states are of a very special nature. And he says an organism has conscious mental states, and only if there is something that it is like to be that organism, something it is like for the organism. And he gives the example of a bat. What we know from the perception of the bats is that, well, they don't see like us. They rely on sound waves. So if we were to try to imagine what it is to be a bat, that would be quite difficult, right? We rely on vision while they rely on sound waves. So he says to be able to show this kind of distinction in an artificial being might prove very difficult. And indeed, David Chalmers, another philosopher, distinguishes two types of problems. The easy ones would be to actually reproduce the kind of intelligence that we humans have. He calls that the easy problems. And then there's the hard problem, which is to explain why our cognitive systems have subjective experience when engaged in information processing. So now, we have two classes of problems, the easy ones and the hard ones. Well, the easy ones are the ones we are all working on at Cross Compass and other companies. And we know basically that if we want to reproduce intelligence, the same kind of intelligence that we humans or animals have, we should look at the brain. Why? Well, when we studied flight, for example, what we did was look at birds, how they fly. They could explain how we could design a machine that flies. Well, we should do the same. We look at the brain. Let's look at the brain. Here's what the brain looks like. Well, it doesn't look like much, right? It's not a machine, it's not a program. It's pretty hard to interpret what's going on in there. Well, there's been a long series of research in neuroanatomy, so now we know a lot about the neuroanatomy of the brain. Well, let's see what they have. Well, okay, we have the different areas of the brain, we have the connections, but it's still very hard to interpret, right? We cannot build a machine that looks like that. Well, we're lucky enough, there is now cognitive neuroscience. And what they could do with the new technologies in neuroimaging, fMRI, MEG, EEG, and so on, was to map not just the anatomy of the brain, but the functions that are subtended by these different areas. And here is what we have. Well, here it's only the cortex and the cerebellum, but there are many substructures. Anyway, it's very easy to interpret now. In the back of the brain, you have the occipital lobe that takes care of the vision. Then you can focus on the parietal lobe that is managing all our sensations, like touch, but also all the part that is perception for action. If I take an object, I'm going to use the parietal lobe to guide my action. Right? There is the cerebellum that handles all the movements that have been automatized over time. If I walk, I use my cerebellum. There is the temporal lobe, which integrates auditory information and creates an abstraction of it. And this area allows us to understand language. And then there is the frontal lobe that does problem solving, decision making, that handles speech and voluntary action and planning. So now we have a nice roadmap of all these different areas. We have the functions, and we start to understand what an intelligent system might require. Right? Okay, so, well, there are many things to do, and I'm only going to give a few examples of the research that we do at Cross Compass. So one is visual detection. So this relies on the back of the brain, the occipital lobe. And what we learn by studying the neuroanatomy of this part of the cortex is that we have receptive fields. These receptive fields will react depending on the characteristics of the local visual properties of the things we see. So we have, for example, cells that would respond to particular orientations in a visual scene. Taking inspiration from these receptive fields, Lequin developed, as we all know, convolutional networks. They used a similar concept. Here the kernel acts as a receptive field, and it goes around the image to check for orientations, for example. So we use this type of networks in our research to develop a more intelligent system for detection here. And this is a work by Daiki Sano. For example, for detection of anomaly, you would have a patch here, and using an autoencoder, you can try to recreate the input. And this type of network has been trained only on normal cases, which means that when there is an anomaly, it will fail to reproduce the anomaly in output. So all we have to do is compare the input and the output, and we will see the anomaly popping out. Then we developed a new method that relies on Hebbian learning to recreate the blobs that correspond to these anomalies, and this is how they appear in the end. This model in blue is the one that relies only on the autoencoder and the comparison that happens here, and with our new method we can achieve a much better performance. Another domain that we are investigating relates to navigation. And by studying the hippocampus, we learned that we have what we call place cells. And neuroanatomy tells us that in this area of the brain, that is subcortical, we can identify specific cells that would respond to, for example, the speed. This is a study on mice, the mice. Speed or the direction of the mice or the orientation of its head and so on. And also there are other cells that would react depending on the distance to the goal. And actually there are also typically placed cells, the ones that would respond when the mice is in a particular location in a maze. So taking inspiration from this kind of navigation, natural navigation intelligence, we can develop algorithms to, for example, manage multi-agents robots in a warehouse. And we investigate different methods using classical AI or genetic algorithms or reinforcement learning. And this is a demo by Daiki Sano again, where we have 40 agents trying to go and fetch their targets. Another task that we've been investigating is motor control. This is extremely important to master this for the industry. There are many cases where you need to grab objects from a bucket and then put them somewhere, manipulate them, and so on and so forth. So to reproduce this motor control, there is a very nice literature on forward and inverse models that was investigated first by Jordan and Rumelat and Wolpert and Kawato. And we basically were able to implement that in an intelligent system that would learn to reach and grasp objects and adjust the orientation of the hand of the robot. Then there is something special about our vision system. It can adapt to the noisiness of the environment. And AIs have struggled in general to do this kind of job. So let's say we train an AI in simulation. This is the kind of scene that we can recreate in simulation. But in the real world, well, this is the kind of image we get, and there is a lot of difference. So if we train the AI on this data, and then we test it on real situations, well, it's going to fail. So what we do, the strategy here is to recreate the noisiness of the real world, so that the AI will be able to have more tolerance in terms of conditions, visual appearances. And by using these methods, so Ramin is working on this part, and other people as well, we are able to go from simulation to the real world. And this is a previous project co-developed with Yasukawa on this task of grasping. Right. I'm not going to talk about more of this research. The last one I want to talk about is the brain decoding. We are going to start very soon. Actually, we already started a few projects on brain decoding. The idea here is to combine humans and AI. And by doing so, the idea is that while a person is doing a task, for example, decision making, we can monitor his neural activity, and using an AI, we will be able to complement or supplement even the behavior of the people. So in the case of the technology that we will use, which is EEG, we can track all activity in the cortex. And we will apply this technique in decision making, but also we will investigate emotions and obviously consciousness. Right, so after about the easy problems, and I'm really sorry to say that all the problems we are working on right now are only the easy problems. I know they are very hard. It's just Chalmers who thinks that these are the easy problems. And his view basically is that we could develop an intelligence that is artificially, that is at the level of humans, but still we will miss the experience. And I disagree. I think that there is no way we can match human intelligence if we do not integrate a mechanism that accounts for how we experience the world. What does it mean? It means that actually, before solving the easy problems, what he calls the easy problems, we have to solve the hard problem. And what does it mean for the AI? The AI will have experience if we manage to solve this problem. In that case, it would be a very different type of AI compared to the one we are developing right now. And there was a term that was falsely used maybe, but we could call this new type of AI a super intelligence, artificial super intelligence or super AI. And this is going to be the question of whether or not we can create this type of AI that has experience. So please bear with me because the last part of the presentation is going to go a bit deeper into different types of concerns in neuroscience, philosophy, and computation. First, I'd like to quickly talk about what we call the neural correlates of consciousness. This term was introduced by Christoph Koch and his colleagues, and the idea was to study the mind and find the types of activity or activations and so on that could be correlated with our experience of the world. And in the literature, we could distinguish what we call the first order level that accounts for our extraction of the sensory information. And for example, for vision, this happens in the occipital cortex, as we've seen before. And our higher order judgments. That is, if you want to say something like, okay, right now, I see that there is a bottle here. So I can talk about it, I am confident also that there is a bottle here. So I'm going to use my frontal cortex to introspect and to have the ability to tell what my experience is. And this happens in the prefrontal cortex, and this has been shown by Antoine Pasquali and his team. However, Christoph Koch in 2004, in his book, The Quest for Consciousness, and it's on my desk if any of you is interested in reading it, he hypothesized that there could be a second order level in the middle, able to somehow connect these two different levels. And a few years past, I investigated this notion with Katsunobu Sakai at Tokyo University. And we were able to identify the second order level, and here in this particular task, we found it in the parietal. Okay, so just keep in mind 3 different types of levels. Okay, if we want to talk about consciousness, there are 2 key concepts. There are actually many, but I want you to focus on 2 key concepts. The first one is metacognition. Metacognition, as I said, relates to the fact that I can report what I'm seeing, the content of my experience. So this is something that would be very useful if we build an AI that can say what it sees, for example, to report why it makes these decisions and so on and so forth. That would be very useful. So David Rosenthal which is an American philosopher, focuses on this notion of reportability. And to him, this matches exactly with the concept of consciousness. He says that for one to be conscious of something, one needs to hold a higher order thought about that thing. That is, as soon as there is the higher order representation that points back to a content, then that content becomes conscious and reportable at the same time. This is the higher order thought theory. And metacognition was also investigated by Axel Clearmans, and in a paper that I co-authored with him and Bert Timmermans, we state that to enable one to know that she knows the knowledge that is in the system must, to enable, something is wrong. One must, the knowledge that is in the system must become knowledge for the system. So you need to re-represent the knowledge in order for the content of that knowledge to become available for the rest of the system. And we describe it in a very nice picture where you have a first order network here. So all sensory information would come as an input to this network, and then it would process that information in order to produce actions, for example, discriminations, anything, right? It's too small, but this says that the brain, at this level, the brain learns about the world, right? So we have a first sensory motor loop that learns about the world. And then the concept of metacognition here is that there is an extraction of the content of this first order network into meta representations, and that allows to provide metacognitive judgments. So there is the higher order network that learns about itself, about the world and about itself. So this is the world concept here. And at the time in 2007, we tried to implement this idea. You can think of this simulation as if you are a computer scientist, you would understand as the equivalent of the exclusive OR, but for metacognition. So here it's similar to the MNIST, where you have to recognize digits. It's just that we used only 7 different lights, like on your digital watch. And we show this as an input, and the network, the first order network, has to discriminate the number that is shown here. Then there is a higher order network that captures the knowledge from within the first order network, and it has to provide a subjective judgment. Here it's like a wager. This second order network has to bet on whether or not the first order network is going to be right or wrong. So I'll give you an example. This is a 6, and the discrimination is right. So this network should say, yes, I bet that you are right. If this is a 6 and the discrimination is 3, and this network must say, no, I don't believe you're right. So it's going to bet low. Okay. Looking at the results, this curve is the performance of the first order network. It starts at chance level. There are 10 numbers, so 1/10, and it goes up to reach 100% accuracy. Then let's look at the performance of the higher order network. We will focus on the case where there is a high learning rate. At the very beginning, we start quite high because the network knows that this network doesn't know anything. So it will always bet high on the fact that it will make mistakes, and that's why its performance is high. Then after some times, as the first order network learns, it becomes more difficult for this one to bet always high on the mistakes, because sometimes this one becomes correct So we see that the second order network starts to go back to the chance level, which is 50-50. You have two possible outcomes here. And then once the first order network starts to actually be performance, well, the second order network this time will have a strategy of betting high when the first order network will be correct. So the second order network doesn't trust the first during this phase, and then it finally trusts it during that phase. And there is this area where you see a U inverted curve that identifies as a period of doubt. And this is very interesting because in metacognition we have this ability to doubt about ourselves. And we were able to implement that. What we discovered through this simulation is that we learn to be conscious. Awareness is something that is acquired, learned over time. And also that we need causally independent redescription from one layer, one level to another in order to perform this kind of metacognition skills. Now, the second key concept I want you to learn about is the concept of phenomenology. Phenomenology is the content of our experience. This is, for example, the colors that you see, the sounds that you hear, and Netblock here refers to what Nagel was saying, but more precisely he says, phenomenal consciousness is experience. The phenomenally conscious aspect of a state, a conscious state, is what it is like to be in that state. Well, this is very close to what Nagel says, but it's a bit more formal as something we can use to implement an artificial consciousness. So, okay, now we have very interesting insight from the neurophysiologist Pascal Fries, who studied consciousness in the brains of primates. And what he found is that changes in the pattern of neuronal coherence, by coherence we mean synchrony in the activities, both locally and across regions, may lead to changes in the contents of consciousness. So he identified a mechanism where, depending on the type of correlations between the zones in the cortex that would respond to an experience, we could say, yeah, they match what happens in the brain and with the experience. So this is a kind of mechanism that we can actually try to implement, and I actually did. And so here's the idea. We have, now that we've identified a second order level, we can imagine that there is some information about the expectations of a person. So, for example, I expect my bottle to be here, so I can have some expectation. In this case, let's say we don't have any expectations. Because of this coherence mechanism, here at the level of my occipital cortex, I receive some of the input, but the noise that comes from the input is mixed with the actual information. And well, there is no temporal structure, there is no coherence. We did not induce any coherence. This input here is like a time series, by the way. So this is at T0, T1, T2, T3, T4, T5, and so on. Okay. And basically, here, no coherence would lead to very weak meta-representation at the second order level. Let's contrast this with a situation where we have expectations. Imagine, well, this is the same pattern, basically. Imagine that I have expectations about this pattern. I expect to see this pattern. This coherence pattern is going to map onto the first order network. and it will create the synchrony. That is, all here all the pixels that correspond to this pattern are going to get synchronized. They are still here, right? But here, well, they appear a bit here, a bit here, a bit here. While here, they are all synchronized every 3 frames. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. They get all synchronized. So that's what this part induces on the first layer. When we have this coherence in the first order, then through the process, I will have a much stronger meta-representation. So this illustrates the mechanism that Fries was talking about. Okay, so now using what we investigated in metacognition and in phenomenology, by putting both together, this is the model that we can construct. Here we receive a sensory input, and there is a representation, time series. These representations are going to be integrated into a meta-representation, which will match or not the coherence pattern. Okay? If there is, actually, I call this the what it is likeness, as Ned Block was pointing out. If there is coherence, if there is some kind of expectation over here, then it's going to synchronize the lower level. And this synchrony, as Fries says, matches our experience. And in philosophy, the experience is also called the qualia. The qualia is like every single bit of our experience. So all this interaction between the first order and the second order layers will support phenomenal consciousness. Then the metacognition part. Between the meta-representation and the higher order representation, we know that when there is a match, when the content of this level becomes the target of a higher order representation at that level, then it becomes reportable. And similarly, a higher order representation would elicit some expectations. If I can report that there is a bottle on the table, then I will expect that the bottle would be useful for me to drink, for example. So this expectation will map back onto the second order layer, create more expectation at this layer, which will enhance the experience at the even lower layer. So we have two components of experience, one related to phenomenology and the other to reportability. And in this model and through the implementation that I used, actually these layers here, they are not two separate things. They are only one, but they are represented by a complex. A complex is as a real part and an imaginary part. And all these layers are represented by complex. Why are they complex? Well, actually, it's just another way of describing signals. Right? Okay. What we can say, and this is a claim that I make, is a definition for consciousness. And I claim that consciousness is a complex function that dynamically affects the coherence of afferent signals in accordance with one's expectations. Right. So, okay, we have this mechanism. It might be right, it might be wrong. Anyway, only the future will tell. Now, to conclude, here's what we learned today. So we could use AI to prove materialism. And what philosophers say is that, okay, yeah, maybe you can recreate the intelligence of biological systems and you can solve the easy problems. But the nature of experience is much harder to grasp and to simulate. On the easy problems, since the advent of deep learning, we have made substantial progress. We can now beat people at very complex games like Go. But what we know is that intelligence is much more complicated than that, and more time and efforts are going to be required to match the complexity of our intelligence. Now, about the hard problem, apparently the neuronal coherence could be a solution, a physical solution to the hard problem, which means maybe we could fully describe and implement our intelligence. And if we do so, if we manage to implement this kind of artificial intelligence that has experience, may we call it an artificial superintelligence, well, not only we will understand better about ourselves, but actually we might well, enter a new age in humanity. I wanted to thank all the people who worked with me on different on this research, and there are the people also the team managers. So Katsunobu, Suzuki, Yuriko, Olaf for management of cross-campus and cross-labs, and Keiko, Daiki, Corentin, Romain, Ramin, James, and Hugo. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Antoine, for summarizing decades, if not centuries or more of research in consciousness. We went a bit over time, but I think that was necessary. Maybe if we can get the light a little bit back. We enter now the second phase of every event, which is discussion. So please, anyone who wants to chime in. Okay. Yeah.
Okay. For a long time I did see consciousness presented, so it's kind of fun. Of course, there's many things. But
can you just say, so you're Julien and you are
okay,
your field?
I'm Julien. Basically, I'm artificial life and a bit the same background as Antoine. And I work for this company, Focus Technology. And okay, my question is basically, why do we need experience? Because you say experience is necessary for creating superintelligence, but there's the other thing that is called a zombie, that, as you know, that is basically everything that your AI can do without the experience part. So far, I don't see why we're not okay with a zombie, for example, to create a robot that is a zombie. Why do we need this experience?
Yes, so if we look simply at the key concept that I introduced, reportability may depend on phenomenology. That is, we might not be able to report anything efficiently unless we have phenomenology. This is one thing. Another aspect is about intelligence. Right? I do believe that we cannot match human intelligence without this kind of mechanism. David Chalmers says, yeah, okay, we can create a philosophical zombie that is exactly like us. Actually, Olaf could be a philosophical zombie because I don't know what his experience is, right? I just assume he has phenomenal experience. And maybe when we will create an AI that matches our intelligence, maybe we will say, oh yeah, no, I don't want to hear about experience. I'm going to pretend that this is a philosophical zombie. But if this AI is able to do all the things we do, there is a lot of chance that actually it needs this kind of mechanism. Why? Because, well, why I can describe my experience, why I can detect this bottle and then interact with it, why I can talk about it, why I can at the same time plan to grab a bite of what's happening over there, why I can handle so many problems at the same time, is basically because through the mechanism of my experience, I'm going to be able to select what is relevant at a particular time. If you build an AI that doesn't have that, well, it can do only one task at a time. If you want the AI to be able to handle many things, general AI, the term that we can describe also. Then at some point, to be able to go from one task to another, you have to have something that selects what is important at the time. I think this is consciousness. Yeah.
I would even go further and say it's impossible to build an AI, like even if you try, that doesn't have what it is likeness. So you can build an AI that can't report on what it's like to process information like that AI, but there is still, if you actually decompose the process and look at intermediate layers, not everything about the physical world is going to be represented in the intermediate layers of the calculation. So there is an answer to what it is like to be that AI, even if that AI doesn't do metacognition on what it is like to be itself yet. So I think you can't escape what it is like, that's at least.
But what if, because here we're talking about, you need this, you need to create this experience so that the robot or the AI could become conscious. But what if it's an epiphenomenon that just appears with just an illusion that actually comes from one particular system that you developed, and then you feel like you have it, but actually it's useless? There are also experiences, because here we talked about the positive things, I mean the positive research is saying there's an experience, right? But there's also the opposite kind of research results that actually show that maybe it's not as clear as one-to-one actually that we need this experience, that maybe it comes from after.
I think this is a misuse of the word emergence, or the misuse of the word epiphenomenon. I think people use it in this context to say that if it's an epiphenomenon, it's not real. But what, you know, if you look at physical systems that exhibit emergence, like the dynamics of water, of, you know, macroscopic water, the things that characterize the emergent phenomenon are actually dominant in determining causally what will happen next with that water. So the microscopics of where the molecules are and so on have less information about where the will flow than the system average variables per sort of bit of description that you commit. So in that sense, if you said consciousness is an epiphenomenon, that actually isn't that's not inconsistent with what's being said here that it's important.
No, but I was not saying that it doesn't exist because of the phenomenon. I'm saying that it reverses what you need to do. You don't need to create experience. If you create like the easy problem, maybe the combination of all of them will give you a feeling of experience the same way. But basically, because here, for example, attention, you don't need to have experience to have attention. And that was a bit what you were describing when you answered me.
So I didn't include attention, but Fry's view extends to access and to attention. And he says that experience, or at least the neural coherence that matches our experience, is there to facilitate the access to the content of that experience. And the access allows you to manipulate the content to, for example, say, to do a report, for example, or to use an object to do something seamlessly. So this is extremely useful for any kind of task. You need this kind of process. And even if the experience comes after the mechanism, it doesn't matter because we need to recreate that mechanism. It's fundamental to intelligence. So once you have recreated this mechanism, there is consciousness, whether you want to dissociate it or not. I don't, personally, but if you want to say this is something on top of it and we don't need to care, sure, once you recreate the mechanism, it's done, it's there. So,
you take a position that is also radical because you
kind
said, because you also said that this consciousness should be reportable, and you follow that line of research. So can you compare that to the other views, and why do you take so reportability might eliminate part of the experience that is not reportable about? Is that possible in your model? And if so, why do you pick? Why do you make that choice?
So there are a zoo of theories about consciousness.
It's yours.
Yeah. So here, this is David Rosenthal's position that consciousness is about reportability, but there are other theories, for example, that would focus more on access or on attention. I think it doesn't really matter in the sense that to me, and this is contrary to other theories, to me consciousness comes first. That is, if you have a look at the model, to me, many things can happen before reportability. There are many mechanisms that are supposedly unconscious, that is unreportable, that can happen because they are automatic processes or objective discrimination, implicit learning. There are many mechanisms here. And whether or not you have coherence, whether or not you have synchrony, some of them could still activate. But you will never go to the second level that depends on attention and on access. All these require these mechanisms chunking to perform subjective judgments, to do control processes. So if I'm trying to guide my hand to grasp the subject, I need here to use consciousness. If I don't use any of that because this is an automated process, then I can grab my bottle just using this level. What I say is that this level only supports a part of consciousness. Without reportability, already there is some part of the mechanism that appear here. And then, by having reportability, you can have access, you can have attention that are going to add more to that layer.
Follow-ups on this, but I want to hear if anyone else. Yeah.
So we tend, like, if you look back at AI research, before AI, people like tend to, when they solve a problem, they immediately say, right, it's not real AI. You know, they thought if robot is playing chess, it's really intelligent, but then this, it's just, research, etc., etc. And we go, up and down, we solving one easy problem after another, and we feel this kind of disappointment. So when we solve a hard problem and we have this AGI that's equivalent to ours, would we be disappointed about ourselves? Say, it's just this pattern matchers screw us and stop to be it as a human kind.
The more you learn about yourself, the more disillusion you have as well. Okay, so you get more mature, and the first stage is you lose your illusions, and this is why it becomes disappointing. You're like, just that. Okay, yeah, maybe then you take time and you can progress. And this is every time that all the easy problems, there's going to be another problem to solve. Intelligence is so complex, right? So why you say, okay, it's just search through a tree of probabilities and so on. It was already an achievement, and nobody says that when Deep Blue beat Kasparov at chess, nobody said, well, this is just random exploration and all. It's still a great achievement.
It is, but it's not special as in, us versus all unconscious matter.
Why us?
Well, sort of we as a human, we have something to get us going, that we believe that we have, whatever the spark.
Yeah. So the thing is, it depends on the theory that you take, but my claim is that it doesn't really, it's not restricted to us. That is, some animals may have the same mechanisms, and to me, probably most of them. Now there's a limit. I don't know where the limit is. If you go back to the ontology of the species, I don't know where it stops. What makes us special, I think, is that, not only we have that, but actually we have a great intelligence. We are not so intelligent. Sometimes we are a bit dumb. But anyway, I think we have a great intelligence. So to learn more about our intelligence by implementing an AI, it will not diminish ourselves, not so much. It's just that we will have to make sure. For sure.
I have a really long one, so you don't have to answer just maybe, unless you have short replies. So can you apply your sort of theoretical framework to Chinese room?
Yeah, please explain the Chinese room.
Well, so it's kind of long argument, which I'm not maybe 100% following myself. The idea is that there is like mental experiments. There is a man in the room and who doesn't speak Chinese, and he has like, all rules, which are like very good rules, and they allow them to translate or to answer like, questions in Chinese. And people just don't see who's inside. They put, you know, put some question or some document. They got a reply, and the reply is correct. Is you know, it sort of pass the Turing test. It's you know.
The man in the room follows a program.
Yeah, but the man just has no idea. He's just a very good pattern matcher. Now he checks the dictionary. He follows. I don't know. Goes to the page 35, writes something. So it's kind of analogy to like the man. Can we say that he knows Chinese in a sense? Yeah.
So the counter argument to this is that we should consider the room as being knowledgeable about Chinese rather than the man in the room. So I'm going to say this is Searle's idea, right? But this is a nice philosophical description of what might be consciousness, but I think it's completely wrong. So I wouldn't even try to apply that. There is no homunculus in my model to say, yeah, I am the one being conscious. No, to be conscious, you have to consider the whole thing, and not just that, but the brain as well. It's the brain, and including the body, that is conscious. It's not just one part of our brain that is conscious.
So would the room be conscious by the
So no, because probably the program, it depends what program it is, I guess, but if it has this kind of mechanism, then yes, that would be the case.
I think that all these metaphors and analogies are very interesting, but it's probably too early, both in neuroscience knowledge and AI knowledge, to say anything definitive. And that will come in a few decades, hopefully. But I think the general danger is that if you try to find more and more human things which machines can do, you get the feeling that, oh, we're getting very close to completely being able to mimic a human. But if I take as an example the structure in academia, where you get tenure if you have enough citations and enough metrics, as they call it, as if the metrics can measure how good you are as a researcher. It's obviously true that if you get a high H number, you're not an imposter. You have proof that you can do something. But some of the most intelligent and the most interesting, the most creative people, they get bored with the whole process. They don't want to game the system and write 100 papers to be measured as good enough to get tenure. And I see the same danger in this process, that we can try to measure more and more things about us which we can also put in there, and then we start to forget what is really the most important thing of what is human. And we can't say what it is, because if you have a fish net and you capture some fish but you don't capture the other fish, and if you look at what is in the fish net, you will never know what you have lost. Do you see what I mean? So that is the biggest danger, and I don't have an answer for how to avoid this problem.
So my way to reinterpret what you're saying is similar to Hegel. That is, he says we cannot imagine what it is like to be a bat. And if we create an artificial intelligence that has experience, we humans cannot imagine what it is like to be a robot. But it's possible that he cannot imagine what it is to be human. And the danger that you're talking about is to pretend that we are going to create an AI that is exactly like us. And I don't think it's possible, because we are building it ourselves. It's going to be different. It's going to be just well, a new type of experience. And that's why if we focus on the what it is likeness, that is, we go step by step and see how this experience is built. We don't have to imagine that it's going to be as rich as the one we have, or as intelligent as we are. We just have to start with something and see how well it performs and see well where it goes. And you don't have to have right from the start high expectations about it. You just go step by step. I think that should be fine. The danger we will speak.
Just very briefly, what I see as a danger is that we may limit our own intelligence to be able to do a handshake and to be recognizable in a conversation with AI. And it may atrophy, it may almost disappear. Just like this ridiculous idea of so-called metrics to determine whether you get tenure, as if you can do that in a formula. It means that many of the most creative people in the past would not have gotten tenure because they wouldn't fit into the system. So what is happening in the group can happen with us individually, that we focus, because if we make a hybrid between humans and AI, we like to talk to them, it's very useful, but we may de-emphasize those qualities which we have which cannot be measured. And I don't want to sound too negative, but there is that danger. So if there is a way to not use a fishnet approach, and like for example, and the best you can do is talk in metaphor. For example, when people started to analyze DNA in seawater, that was very interesting because they got the DNA of all the creatures in the seawater, all the single cells, even the ones which you could not put in a Petri dish, you couldn't even necessarily see, you didn't know what to do, you just have the DNA as a marker for everything. Then you have to reverse engineer and say, well, what kind of organisms could there be in there? So if we could do a mental DNA, if we could not use a fishnet approach where we can mimic this, we can mimic that, if we would have a way to really get a global perspective on all that we could do. And at the moment I would have no idea how to do that, but maybe 30 years from now with increased neuroscience and increased AI, maybe we can go from Petri dish to DNA of seawater type of approach. Does it make sense?
Yeah, I think we can either have a holistic approach and we will investigate any kind of experience that we want to input in an artificial being, and then we shouldn't restrict us.
But we don't have the technique to do that. Just like
we might, as long as we know how to feed this experience. That is, this is some kind of a recipe about the experience. So once we understand this mechanism, we can, if we fully understand this mechanism, we could recreate any kind of experience in a way.
But this is a theory, and this is a filter. This is like a fishing net, which takes some recognizable parts, which if you mimic them can reproduce what we say, but that exactly has the danger that a small fish goes through the net and that you don't capture it in your theory and therefore don't capture it in your instantiation in an AI.
I feel like the model is, the word filter comes to mind, where you may understand some of it better thanks to this model. But the difficulty is similar to a very much easier problem than consciousness, which is living systems. So that's kind of my field, which is what makes a system alive. And for many years, people have been trying to define it in terms of chemical reproduction, replication, or they pointed to one thing and they said, that is it. This is what life is. And what was it again? The example of the rabbit was that you point to characteristics of a rabbit being alive, but actually if you point to this nice rabbit alone, it cannot reproduce. So actually you missed part of life. And every time you try to pick one filter, you seem to miss a lot of other properties. So what we do in artificial life, which is really a crutch. Just one way to solve parts of the problem is we factor out properties, so we make many filters, and that's no solution either. But I'm guessing that we'll have to go through the same kind of way in consciousness science.
So I wanted to add, it reminds me of the problem of scientism, of trying to describe everything in scientific terms and how futile that is. And just, if you're trying to do something scientifically, you have to come up with a metric, you have to come up with an experiment, a model, to prove the model. And there's so many things that you just can't do that with. And it reminds me of that similar problem. Or there are like human languages, for example, which are so different from the way that we think in our own language. They're difficult to translate. And it's like we may come up with some model for something like doubt, but how could we possibly come up with a model for a word in some other language which none of us comprehend? I mean, it's necessarily impossible for us. It's along these lines, I think, this colleague, my colleague here was saying.
So, both of you mentioned the measures or the metric. So in psychology, we study consciousness using two metrics that are the objective performance and the subjective performance. That is, for a task that is predefined and perfectly controlled, we're going to be able to measure on people or on animals the kind of experience that they have through these two metrics. So this allowed, for example, to create the model, and then you try to match the model to that. Obviously, there is no equivalent between my model, the digit simulation, and what happens in the brain, but it's supposed to explain what's happening. Now, I see more or less what you said. Once you have a model and you pretend that this is what happens, then there is a danger that actually you miss the little parts where that part is different, right? Mm-hmm. So I don't think we should just rely on the metrics. That is, I don't want to have a behavioral approach, and I don't want to explain just everything with scientific terms. It's not about that. I think it's an investigation anyway. And once you have a model, it's like, okay, you sketch. You want to build a house. First you sketch it. And then, okay, you bring some blocks of concrete and you put it there. And then, slowly by slowly, you're going to build your whole house. And then you're going to say, I need a bed. Or I need water. I need electricity and all that. And you bring that stuff as it goes. But you have to start somewhere. And the somewhere is the sketch. Right?
A few more minutes. I think, Martin, did you have something that you really wanted to say? You were very active.
No, not necessarily. I mean, no, not. I mean, I kind of disagree. I kind of think I'm kind of a scientist. I'm like, I guess I'm like a fan of scientism in the end. Like, I mean, I'm not going to give up just because things are difficult. And,
that's reasonable. You had something.
Yeah, I guess, I don't know, I feel bad saying it because this is what I would say immediately before your talk, but I think in terms of Pete's comment, it might be important to agree on. I really hate the term superintelligence, and I think that the kind of thing that Pete was talking about is why I hate it. Because I think if you said in your talk, I'm interested in metacognitive abilities and the ability to introspect on the thought process and what sorts of things that might let an agent do and how one would build a network to do it and what that might enable. None of this would be nearly as contentious, but there's a tendency when people talk about consciousness, especially when people talk about it in a sort of outside of specific implementation, specific neuroscience or psychology models, things like that, but like in a colloquial sense, to identify consciousness with humanness and to identify it with something which we feel we want to be special about ourselves. And then there's the problem that if you say, I've explained this and this and this, someone says, oh, but there's a thing that I think is special about me that you haven't explained, and that's the fish getting through the filter. But if we just accept that, you know, in general, we should work with words that don't mean everything, including the things we haven't thought of, but use words that mean things that we're saying, then this problem goes away. right? It's fine if I say superintelligence that I want that to mean every possible thing that could make something in the universe intelligent, even things that humans don't do that. And that's too much, because we're always going to miss something.
So I think the term super-AI here is just to make the distinction between the AI that we have today and the potential of the AI that we can have with this kind of mechanism if we manage to implement it. So I don't think that an AI which will have these mechanisms should be called the same as the one that can play Go, for example, or the ones that we use in our factories today. I think this is not a mechanism that I would use today, even if it was available for a simple task such as grasping. I don't need consciousness to do grasping. And I want to separate somehow the AIs that only solve one problem from AIs that have, this kind of intelligence. And it's not about matching our intelligence, it's not about comparing our intelligence with that of an AI. It's just about making this distinction. I don't know what term we could use, but
people talk about this as one-shot learning or generalization or metacognition, even just meta learning.
So even one-shot learning right now, I don't think it has any inner experience. So I cannot use that term.
Just to make sure, on the other end of things, you said you mentioned function, right? So do you think that by creating this, you have the potential for direct binding to functions, as in solving problems in the world, or classes of problems in the world, and that it has to be that way?
Yeah, I'm not sure, because there's still a debate about the role of consciousness, whether this has a function or not. And actually, David Rosenthal says there is no function, despite the reportability. It's reportable, but the experience per se has no function. This is it. In my case, and some others say that we should call the state consciousness, not the function. In my view, it's because I use this complex representation in the different layers. It's easier to call that function because this is something that we can describe in terms of mechanism. When I say function, I also think mechanism. So yeah, to me it has the purpose, this mechanism, and I don't know exactly how to use it. That's part of the process.
So, that's not a question that we need to answer now. Okay.
Yeah, I have a very simple question. Slide 18, I think it was with the value of data. Yeah, you mentioned that if the model starts out by always guessing no, how do you know that it doesn't switch to always guessing yes after the value of doubt, as you call it? And if not, how can you make sort of conclusions about intelligence if it's never better than something so simple?
So this is pretty stupid. You see there are 100 neurons here, 100 neurons there. But the point here is, yes, it does exactly that. That is, in this case, in this simulation, it bets high on the first order making mistakes all the time here. And then it becomes forced to say, oh no, actually, maybe I'm wrong. And then sometimes around here it's going to say, maybe you're right, maybe you're wrong. And that's why it goes back to this level of chance. And then as soon as the first order network starts to be performant, then the second one will get high all the time.
Yeah.
This is the problem with this network, but I have different models with different tasks. And there is so this one is from 2007, but in 2010 I actually worked on another type of task where I would train first the higher order network, and then I would disconnect and retrain a new first order network, and then plug back my higher order network. And then this time, this one was really causally independent. Here, there is no independence actually, but on the other one, there is a pure causally independent relationship. And then this time, yeah, he would actually look inside the first order network and say, yeah, no, here you don't know what you're talking about, I'm going to say that you are wrong. And here, oh yeah, you seem to know what you're talking about. That's fine. So yeah, you are right about the fact that here there is a strategy, but actually there are other models where it's not about strategy.
The causal relation between my stomach and the rest of my body has tells me that we should thank you for the talk. Thank you for and we go into